So that's why we're in the book of Colossians. It was written about 52 AD, probably 20 or so years after Jesus had risen from the dead. Paul's writing it from prison. Nobody really knows which prison he was in. Some people think it was Ephesus. Some people think that it was Rome. It doesn't really matter. Paul's in prison. He's with his friend Timothy, his child in the faith. And he gets word from a guy named Epaphras about a situation going on in a place called Colossae. And one of the things you need to know about this book as we study it is that Paul had never actually been to Colossae. He did not plant this church like he planted the church in Ephesus. He planted a lot of churches, but Paul didn't plant the church in Colossae. But just because he didn't plant it didn't mean that he wasn't interested in what was going on there. And it doesn't mean that he didn't have some kind of influence over its existence. The way that the church in Colossae got planted is really because of Paul's ministry. If you remember in Acts chapter 19, or just really the second half of Acts, you see Paul's ministry expanding all over the world. And one of the places that he did ministry was a place called Ephesus. You guys remember this? Ephesus, he stayed longer in Ephesus than he did many other places. It says in Acts chapter 19, verse 10, that during Paul's 2-year stint there in Ephesus, as he taught the whole counsel of God, that the whole region of Asia became Christians, both Jews and Greeks, that the gospel went to all people. Now, the reason that the gospel went to all of Asia isn't because Paul traveled from Ephesus to everywhere else in Asia. The reason that the gospel went to all of Asia is because Ephesus was a mega city in the ancient world, and people came from all over the known world in Asia into Ephesus. And so Paul, as a strategic church planter, picks the most in and out kind of place that he could have picked to plant a church. And so as people are coming into Ephesus, he's preaching the gospel. People are becoming Christians. And from that place of conversion and discipleship, they're going back out to their homelands. And one of the people that got converted under the ministry of Paul in Ephesus was a fellow named Epaphras. And guess where Epaphras lived? Where's his hometown? Colossae. In fact, he didn't just plant one church in Colossae. He planted 3 churches in the Lystra Valley. One of them was Laodicea. You might remember that church from the book of Revelation. And another one was Hierapolis. Kind of an interesting name, Hierapolis. But he planted those 3 churches. And what is happening in the book of Colossians is Epaphras is coming to the Apostle Paul in prison. And he's saying, Paul, a lot of things are going good. A lot of exciting stuff happening in the church there at Colossae. They love each other. Their faith is rich. But there are some concerning elements as well. And the reason we're studying the book is because some of the concerning elements that had arisen in their church are elements that are present in our day and age today. Many of the positive things that were taking place in their church are positive things that are taking place in our church today. And I think there are so many things we can learn from this book for our own Christian experience. Look at Colossians, just to kind of give you a orientation to the book. Colossians chapter 4, verse 12. It's you get introduced to this guy named Epaphras. Epaphras, it says, Epaphras is one of you. He's a hometown local. Colossae was not a huge city, at least at this time. It wasn't as small as Roby, but it's kind of maybe the size of Abilene. Okay, not a mover and a shaker, but he's a local Abilenian. He's a hometown boy. He is a servant of Christ Jesus, and he greets you. He's struggling with you, agonizing over you on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in the will of God. So the reason Epaphras came to Paul, the reason Paul's writing the book, is because the good things that were taking place he needed to amplify, and some of the concerning elements he needed to neutralize. The most concerning element, the reason that I think is pertinent to us today, the technical term for it is called syncretism. It's when you take the gospel or you take something pure and you blend it with something else. And in the case of this letter, they took the biblical gospel of grace, the gospel that was given from Christ to the apostles, from Paul to Epaphras. They took that gospel and they blended it with something else. They blended it with a little bit of Jewish traditionalism. They also blended it with a little bit of monasticism. Don't eat this, don't touch that. They blended it with a little bit of Greek philosophy, and later that heresy would materialize and become known as Gnosticism, but at this day and age, it wasn't quite called that. It was just a deviation of the gospel, sounded good. In fact, they would say the gospel is good, you need to believe in Jesus, but you also need something else, Jesus plus something else. And what Paul is writing to them is to say, it's not that Jesus plus anything, it's Jesus plus nothing. That's what's going to give you everything. And if you add anything to Jesus, Jesus plus anything is no longer the gospel. It's no longer good news. And so you need to keep the first thing first. Keep the main thing, the plain thing. Don't water it down. Don't add to it. Otherwise, you're going to jeopardize what God's doing in your church. And the same thing's true today in our church. We probably don't have a lot of Jewish traditionalism affecting our church right now. No Jewish people rising up doing that. We probably don't have monastic tendencies rising up in our church family. Don't touch this, don't taste that. But there is in our culture a tendency to sometimes take the gospel of Jesus Christ and blend it with a little bit of, we'll say, the American dream. Or blend it with a little bit of, say, cultural Christianity, where what the gospel actually says and what people actually believe Christians are supposed to believe, you don't know where the Bible ends and America begins. How much of our Christian religion is influenced from our Bible Belt culture and our American culture? How much of the American dream have we imported into what we believe about the gospel? And I'm not saying it's a huge threat, but it is a threat. It wasn't a huge threat in Colossae, but it was a threat that Paul took seriously. And as we enter into 2017, of all the things that could happen to us, and there are many things that could happen to us, the way to persevere through all of that, the way to experience true life change, to honor your resolutions, is to keep the first thing first, which is the gospel. So let's